Hey film fans, can a film be influential, groundbreaking, important, while at the same time being dated and, if not controversial, at least a little problematic? Of course. This happens in the art world all the time throughout history. Something comes out, it makes a splash, it influences its generation of peers and also generations of artists to come, while at the same time remaining kind of wedded to its era and the problems of that era or the issues of that era that maybe seem resolved or no longer of consequence or even maybe controversial. The problem is that sometimes art like that falls through the cracks. It gets forgotten or at least shunted aside when perhaps it should be celebrated or at least appreciated or at least understood for the way its axes of influence continue to sort of affect its art realm today. Such is the case with the 1969 film Putney Swope, which I'd like to consider in this episode of what makes this film great. Hi film fans. Before we get into the analysis of what makes Putney Swope great, I just wanted to cut in because while I was making this video, I received the news that Robert Downey Sr. had passed away. And I just wanted to say one or two things about that I think it's worth acknowledging. I don't talk about Downey himself a lot in the video. I mean, I talk about the film a lot and he made it. And so by extension, I guess I'm kind of talking about him, and I am a little bit critical of parts, which I feel a little bad about now, but that's the nature of film criticism, and I think he would want it that way, from what I can tell. But it is worth saying a thing or two about Downey. He was somebody who kind of existed at the margins of Hollywood history, but whose reach and whose influence extended right into the center. At least in terms of American independent cinema, American art cinema, and how they've found a way to exist within Hollywood these days, and in the 80s and in the 70s and back to the late 60s. So I thought I'd just say a couple words about him and then I'll get into Putney Swope. Robert Downey Sr. was born in 1936, and he was a master of the absurd. He was a low-budget filmmaker, and that is how he got his start, and that's the kind of reputation that he maintained, even as he developed high-profile friendships. I mentioned in the video his friendship with Hal Ashby, which was very important, and I'll actually come back to that in a minute. He chose, as a filmmaker, to continue an idiosyncratic, individualized approach to making American cinema. He was an absurdist. He was a comic. He was a sketch artist. He was a consummate storyteller who understood that narrative doesn't have to develop solely through these sort of prescriptive norms of storytelling where we have a beginning, a middle, and end, where we introduce a protagonist and their world, then we have an inciting incident, and then the protagonist debates whether to engage with the incident, which they always do, and then they go through a series of trials or conflicts or obstacles or whatever you want to call it from your filmmaking class. They learn and they grow, and through those obstacles and through that growth and development, they become the hero who can, in the last 20 minutes, vanquish the movie's main conflict or bad guy. And that's kind of Hollywood storytelling. And Downey resisted that. And to his credit, even when he probably could have moved into the mainstream and he dallied with the mainstream, he chose to maintain that absurdist, idiosyncratic approach. And that garnered him a lot of respect. And it means that his films are Not always easy to watch, not because they're necessarily difficult, but because I think we as viewers are trained to watch a certain type of film. Even if you say, like, I like horror, I like rom-com, I like action. I don't know where those voices came from. That last one was kind of a Putney Swope voice. You're still watching a very kind of prescriptive, for the most part, narrative through line. And Downey resisted that and saw that you could tell stories by building absurdities upon absurdities, and meaning would come out of the set pieces, but also out of the interstices between the set pieces, the dialogue in between them, and the meaning that was created from the odd, bizarre instances that he captured on camera. And I just like to point to two and talk a little bit about their influence. One comes from Putney Swope, and I was going to include it in the video that will follow this, but didn't, and it's this scene.
Swope, I think we're still in the ball game. Wing Sony just got off the elevator and he's dying to meet you.
Wing Sony?
Wing Sony.
Wowie. Hey, man. What's his thing? Do-it-yourself Pearl Harbor?
He's Chinese, Swope.
I don't care what he is. We're gonna get that account.
Let's go.
Paul Thomas Anderson has spoken a lot about Downey's influence on his own filmmaking career, and in fact, Anderson cast Downey in Boogie Nights and in Magnolia in small roles. And if you've seen Boogie Nights, that scene with the firecrackers should feel very familiar, because I can't show the whole thing, but there's this celebrated scene from Boogie Nights.
Huh? We got something there?
There it is. That's a fat half key right there. And that is some quality shit. If you want it,
Oh, don't worry about it.
that out. I mean, go ahead. You know, if you want it.
No, wait.
That is a very direct homage to Downey and Putney Swope. Another one that's really interesting comes from this scene in his film Greaser's Palace. Now, I didn't show the whole scene there, that goes on for a little while longer, but what you notice is this light, effortless walking and then dancing upon water. 10 years later, 9 years later, while making the film Being There, Hal Ashby would conceive of the idea of having Chance end the film by walking on water. The first person he called was Downey to say, how did you do that? Downey told him about this certain kind of airport ramp that he used, and Ashby went out and got one and did the same thing for the celebrated ending of Being There. So there's a very direct influence from Downey on Greaser's Palace to Ashby and Peter Sellers on Being There. And those are just two of the many ways that Downey's gift for the absurd and gift for it's not just the absurd and it's not just the silly, it's the cinematic absurdity. It's the way he could take a situation that is seemingly normal and twist it and yank it and prod it in a direction where that just shouldn't happen. That's not real. That's unbelievable. But that was the point. The point was to push the films to places where real life, or whatever it might be, wouldn't go, to provoke. And for that, his career is celebrated, but not very well known. So as I walk you through Putney Swope a little bit, and I barely touched the surface of this film, spoiler for what's to come, just keep that in mind, and maybe go out and watch a couple Downey films. Look him up, read some of the tributes that are coming out this weekend, and think about all of the people who are talking about him and his influence. He's a little known figure from the Hollywood era, but an important one, or as he might call himself, that's his opening title card for Putney Swope. Anyway, rest in peace, Robert Downey Sr. Thank you for your films. Thank you for giving us your son. And thank you for your dedication to absurdity, difficulty, and not towing the line of the mainstream. And now, back to what makes this film great. Putney Swope is a 1969 satirical, absurdist look at the American advertising industry. It was written and directed by Robert Downey Sr., who most people probably know today as the father of Robert Downey Jr., with really fantastic, if low-budget, cinematography by Gerald Kotz and editing by Bud Smith. I believe this was his first film, or his first film on which he's credited, but he would go on to play a huge role in 1970s cinema, particularly working on films with William Friedkin like The Exorcist, Sorcerer, and others. It features Arnold Johnson in the lead role as Putney Swope, and 70s film connoisseurs will recognize Antonio Fargas, who's actually probably most famous for playing Huggy Bear on the TV show Starsky and Hutch, and Alan Garfield, who would show up in sort of supporting roles throughout the 70s, particularly in one of my favorite roles in Nashville. What is Putney Swope about? It's about an advertising firm in New York City, and in the opening scenes of the film, we're in a boardroom, and the boardroom is dominated by these sort of corporate speak advertising white men in suits sitting around a giant boardroom. It's almost recognizable in Mad Men, if you've watched that television show, the way they sort of pitch ideas. It's obviously a spoof, but barely. And early in the film, after about 3 or 4 minutes, the CEO, or the chairman rather, of the company shows up and proceeds to die. In the room is one man, Putney Swope, the film's named after, who's the only black member of the board. And he has spoken up early on to talk about how he thinks it's irresponsible for this advertising firm to create ads for toy gun companies. This is 1969, and he's concerned that selling toy guns is doing detrimental harm to the young men of America. And he doesn't say young black men, but it seems to be implied by what he's talking about, how guns are destroying our neighborhoods and things like that. He's mostly laughed off, respectably, but laughed off. Then, after the chairman dies in this really absurdist scene, the rest of the board decides, they look at the bylaws and, oh, we have to vote on a new chairman right now. Everyone gets a vote, but no one can vote for himself. So what happens is they all start to make deals. Will you vote for me? Will you vote for me? If you vote for me, I'll give you this. If you vote for me, I'll give you that. There's a round of sort of trading, and then they vote. And except for 2 of the board members, everyone votes for Putney Swope. The reason seeming to be that they all believed that no one else would vote for the black man, so it was a safe vote for them against everybody else. But in the end, it's like 9-2 in favor of Swope, so he becomes the new chairman of this advertising firm and immediately begins to make radical changes, including firing most of the white members of the board and bringing in a collection of young black talent. This all happens like in the first 10 minutes. He then proceeds to rename the advertising firm Trust and Soul Incorporated and declares that this advertising firm is going to tell the truth. It's going to make ads that are grounded in reality. It's going to rise up from the streets and tear the system down and rebuild something in its place. And the rest of the film grapples with the possibility or the reality of that, because there are forces outside corporate America. the President of the United States, the government, and all that he represents. And the needs of Swope's workers, including the young black radicals, for financial compensation, for a say in how the companies run, and so on. So there's infighting that continues that, in a lot of ways, although the language is different and the attitudes are different, replicates the infighting we saw amongst the sort of older white upper crust boardmen in the opening scenes of the film. Can Putney Swope keep his drive for integrity alive as he negotiates the minefields of reality in the upper echelons of corporate America? That's the film's story, but that's not necessarily what it's about. Robert Downey was an absurdist, and his approach to making movies, while it's kind of grounded in an American narrative linearity, is less concerned with sort of things like continuity, beginning, middle, end, character development, all the things that we kind of think of as standard Hollywood narrative and stylistic tropes. Those are there. This is not a completely sort of radical film in terms of its form and style, but the narrative is secondary to the absurdity, the humor, and the film is really a collection of set pieces from its opening through to the very end, where this kind of contextual milieu of advertising, an old-fashioned white family-run advertising firm taken over by young New York black radicals. What kind of humor, what kind of absurdity, what kind of somewhat trenchant political commentary can we find in that situation? So to watch the film for its story and for some sort of meaningful resolution is to be disappointed. It's more to watch the film for each of these set pieces, some of which are still hilarious today. I'll show you a few. Some of which are quite politically astute. Some of which are dated and kind of just don't land, I think, anymore. And I'm kind of quite open to placing myself as a viewer in the historical context and going, I get why that's not funny today, but would have been funny then. With some of the scenes, I wonder if it was still funny then. Although, based on the film's influence and the way that future filmmakers from Downey's time to today attest to the film's influence, I imagine all the scenes land with somebody. But it's really an exercise in a different kind of filmmaking. It is an independent film. Downey had to finance a lot of it on his own. He had to distribute it on his own. A lot of theaters in America wouldn't even exhibit it, so he had to make deals to even get it into the cinema. And not a lot of people saw it. But the people who did loved it. It was considered radical, groundbreaking, far out, all of those sorts of things for years afterwards. It still is today. There's a Criterion version, for example, and people will continue to kind of quote this film, but I don't really see it being taught a lot in film studies courses. It could be outside of my sort of realm of contacts, or written about or talked about a lot beyond sort of, oh yeah, there was Putney Swope. In part because Downey was friends with, Cassavetes and Ashby and all of these sort of figures. So when they talk about their influences, they bring up Downey. But it's a film that I think really deserves to continue to be considered for the way its absurdity blends with this kind of trenchant political commentary, even when it misfires in ways that a lot of American cinema wasn't trying to do in the late 60s and 70s, even the political cinema of the New Hollywood era. Just to give you a flavor for what I mean by the film's absurdity, let's watch the opening 2.5 minutes.
like you to meet Dr. Alvin Weasley. Dr. Weasley is one of the most respected motivational researchers in the country. Harvey's beer has dropped 84%. So Dr. Weasley will tell us how the American public really feels about beer. Dr. Weasley.
Beer is for men who doubt their masculinity. That's why it's so popular at sporting events and poker games. On a superficial level, a glass of beer is a cool, soothing beverage. But in reality, a glass of beer is pee-pee dicky. That's it.
Beautiful. 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 Beautiful.
Pee-pee Dicky. We paid for that?
28,000, and we got off easy.
The man made some very perceptive statements.
This, I love this scene. It makes me think about early on in Mad Men, and it's hard to watch this film today, having seen Mad Men, and not look at comparisons, even though they're very different in a lot of ways. But early in season 1 of Mad Men, they bring in that psychiatrist who talks about how advertising is all about the death drive, and Draper ends up, throwing her theses in the garbage can while he's smoking his cigarette, right? This guy just walks in, talks about, alcohol, beer is about fragile masculinity, which is great to hear this term being used in the late 60s. Walks out and everybody's kind of blown away by his nonsense. He's absurd, they're absurd, and this is the tone that runs throughout the entirety of the film. Smith's editing work in the film is fantastic, and I want to show you just a really short early scene. This is when Swope takes over as the chairman, and how editing is used to convey really quickly and really succinctly the changes that he makes in the board.
The changes I'm going to make will be minimal. I'm not gonna rock the boat. Rocking the boat's a drag. What you do is sink the boat. And there's no sense sinking nothing unless you can salvage with productive alternatives. And brothers, you can't change nothing with rhetoric and slogans. Because if a man's really got the truth in his pocket, he doesn't talk about it. He hangs it out on a shingle where people can see it. So from now on, the name of this agency is Truth and Soul. Yes, baby. That's right.
That is fantastic. That's a great example of narrative match editing, where we get what seems like a continuous scene. There's obviously a cut there, and the narrative jumps forward, who knows, weeks, months, a half a year, something like that. But it tells us everything we need to know in an instant. It's fantastic. Astute viewers might notice there that there's something that might seem a little bit off about Johnson's voice as Putney Swope, and that's because it's not Johnson's voice. It's Downey's voice. Downey has insisted throughout the sort of intervening 50 years that Johnson kept blowing his lines, and so he overdubbed his voice because of that. I find this a little bit hard to believe because the syncing between Downey's voiceover delivery and Johnson's mouth movement is pretty seamless. So it's hard to believe that he was blowing his lines if he's saying exactly what's coming out of his mouth in Downey's voice. Now, obviously there could be moments where, and there are some throughout the film where Swope talks and we're seeing the back of his head and maybe he blew that line, but sort of ADR would take care of that, and you don't need to have the entire actor's voice taken out. And this is something that some scholars would point to as one of the film's problems, because I don't think Downey's voiceover is kind of heightened offensive white black voice. I don't know if you can use a term like this, but you know, he's not talking jive turkey mofo stuff. But it seems like in a film with this subject matter and coming out when it did, to replace the lead performer's voice with the voice of a white man, even the director, was a misguided decision on the part of Downey. Now, maybe Johnson's voice just didn't work. Did it have to be Downey who replaced him? These are all questions that are hard to answer. I've tried to find interviews with Johnson where he talks about this, but I haven't been able to find any. If any of you know of any interviews written or on video where Johnson talks about having his voice taken away, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to know more about them. But throughout the film, you get this voice where Downey's talking like this, and you do get used to it. And part of the reason you get used to it is because Johnson's performance otherwise is fantastic. He embodies his character so well, and he plays defeated, he plays angry, he plays curious, he plays sexy, he plays Swope like a fully realized three-dimensional character in the midst of this kind of two-dimensional comedic absurdity that surrounds him. So Downey's voice, even though every once in a while you're like, wait a second, it kind of almost fades into the background because Johnson's performance is so strong. It's hard to really talk about the film in terms of its story development or its character development. I'm just tempted to sort of throw one amazing scene after another at you, because despite the film's kind of limitations or its datedness in some ways, it's just so fun and so fantastic to watch. Look at this scene where one of the few remaining white executives comes to Swope and asks him for a raise.
Excuse me, Mr. Swope. Can I speak to you a minute?
Sure.
Mr. Swope, I do exactly the same job as the other executives, but I don't make as much money as they do. I don't think that's right.
If I give you a raise, everybody's gonna want a raise. And if I give them a raise, they'll still be making more money than you. And we'll be right back where we started.
I never thought of it that way.
And that's why you get less money. 'Cause you don't think.
Thank you.
This is hilarious. That character barely figures in the film, but what is going on here? First, there's the absurdity and the circular logic, which is just a great example of comic, not surrealism, but absurdity. It's ridiculous. But it's also, again, this kind of trenchant political commentary on the way this kind of white power structure in America uses circular logic to keep its boot on the neck of Black Americans, women, gay Americans, and so on. You can almost substitute any minority group there who has been constantly told by the sort of white patriarchal structure just because, basically, right? But in a way that, you know, you can't argue with this jackass, right? Swope's doing it on purpose. That's what makes it pointed. It's not just a jackass moment, it's a in-your-face moment. And that's where the pointedness comes from, but it's all just really funny. There are a lot of great running jokes throughout the film. Putney Swope changes his outfit throughout the film as he's constantly trying to navigate the political waters of sort of Black power of the late 60s. So we see him wearing sort of a beret and a black outfit, which sort of echoes the Black Panthers. Later, we see him wearing a Castro outfit, which sort of conveys a more socialist, radical ideology. He wears African clothes on occasion, which convey that kind of sort of African nationalist ideology, which pervaded a lot of Black Power movements in the late 60s. And it's almost as if he's trying these on. And there's two sides to this, and it's one of the wonderful things about the film, although again, possibly problematic in being written and directed by a white man. But it's nevertheless, it's quite astute in the way Putney Swope is dedicated to his sense of integrity and ideology, but he also has to fish around for existing ideologies of integrity to latch onto, in part because, you know, white America had done such a good job for the previous 3 centuries of minimizing, marginalizing, or erasing a kind of organic American Black ideological structure, so that he's not grounded in a past. He's grounded in this moment, this fervent, probably exciting, potentially dangerous, violent moment of Black identity or identities coming forth. And he's trying to find the one that works best for him so that he can navigate these waters while keeping his integrity. And it's not always easy. And that changing costume is sort of replicated in his changing approach to advertising. What does it mean to speak the truth? What does it mean to have soul? And what happens is that as he dedicates himself to this, you know, pursuit of truth, the firm becomes more and more successful, and more companies want to advertise with him. But they want that Putney Swope magic, but they also want to sell their product. So he begins to be somewhat compromised. So his approach to how he's going to advertise these products changes in a way that his costume also changes. Other running jokes, some of them are really funny. There's this photographer who keeps showing up and saying this.
Mr. Swope, mark focus. This for Hertz. That's Colgate. That's Nabisco. That's IBM.
Over and over again. Later, he shows up at the White House, and you can replace all those products with former presidents. He's talking about Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and so on. And he just shows up every once in a while and gives this same line. There's a great running gag about Putney Swope and his wife in their mansion and their white maid, who always seems to be around when she shouldn't be. And his wife treats her horribly, which is, again, a kind of role reversal, which the film has been doing from its beginning. The wife is horrible to her, but she is also like in their bedroom trying to clean up when they're trying to have an intimate moment, just where she shouldn't be, and it keeps getting more and more absurd. There are also moments of repetition that aren't necessarily running gags, but visual elements of the mise en scène that play throughout. So throughout the advertising firm, there are posters of historical Black figures, some quite contemporary. And eventually we start to see posters of Putney Swope and some of his colleagues hanging on the wall, as if to indicate that they're part of this tradition or that they think they're part of this tradition. Again, it kind of plays both sides of this. A flip side of that is this scene.
Are you putting me on?
Where you been, Pat?
Mecca.
The man says he's the president of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a powerful moment, I think, to see African American men throwing darts at a poster of Abraham Lincoln that I imagine in 1969 would have seemed even more radical when Lincoln was even more a figure of reverence than he is today, which is still pretty high. So the film like weaves these tapestries of visual continuity and visual narrative through its use of clothing, through its use of running gags, and through its use of sort of production design and mise-en-scène. One of the things you'll have noticed by now is that the film is in black and white, and that's true for most of the film, except that we get to see some of the advertisements that Truth and Soul Incorporated make. And these are fantastic because these ads are spoofs of ads, and there's so much going on in them that are these truthful from the streets? Are these meant to be spoofs of existing ads? Are these meant to be indication that Swope is selling out? Or, you know, the ads are all of these things at once, and there's a lot of them. And I'm just going to show you this one for acne cream. Check this out.
It started last weekend at the Yale Howard game. Girl, I saw your beaver flash. I'll never be the same. Oh no.
You gave me a soul kiss. Boy, it sure was grand. You gave me a dry hump behind the hot dog stand. Oh, yeah.
I used to have pimples, but I made them disappear.
He faced life with face off. It made his skin so clear.
A pimple is simple if you treat your pimples right.
My man uses face off. He's really out of sight, and so are his pimples.
That's crazy, right? Some of the lines in that, it's so funny. And it's kind of radical in its use of a mixed race couple. It's ridiculous in its language. And it's also an obvious spoof of the American advertising industry. There's a lot more I could say about this film. I haven't said anything about the depiction of the President of the United States and his wife, who are both played by little people, which is a joke that is both kind of really funny, but also probably politically incorrect today. They're played as sort of fully realized, albeit comedic like everyone else in the film, characters, and they want Swope to do an advertisement for them for a car firm, which is run by this German, pretty obviously anti-Semitic. And some of his jokes, he's meant to be anti-Semitic and it's meant to be making fun of anti-Semitism, but his jokes are hard to listen to today. And his influence on the president is, it's meant to be a point of satire, but it's also, I think it's one of the things that doesn't go over as well today, at least from me. Other viewers, let me know if you think it works. There's a running story about Antonio Fargas's character who's called the Arab. doesn't quite work, and he's a character who thinks that he's more soulful, more real, more truthful than Swope, and he's kind of slowly running a mutiny from within inside the firm, and he has a big role to play, including perhaps having a relationship with Swope's wife, who's a model for the company. There's a lot going on. Like I said, it's really one skit or sketch or set piece after another. So because of that, it's able to build in a lot of different information, a lot of different narrative strands, some of which kind of just get dropped because they're a joke, some of which finally come to fruition in the end, where the film, again, is kind of saying two things at the same time. And I don't want to talk about it too much because it's quite visually interesting to look at, but it's quite ambiguous in terms of what the film is saying. And in the end, I think the film is ambiguous because it wants to be a sort of trenchant critique of the American advertising industry. It very clearly wants to be very critical of American race relations in the 1960s, but it's full of kind of off-color humor. It's full of moments where sort of racial epithets of different types, not just about Black Americans, but also Asian Americans and Jewish Americans get used in ways that probably seemed sort of the moment at the time, but today seem kind of off-putting. But those moments are few and far between. Mostly, this film is really funny, and it really is kind of surprising that something like this came out in 1969, and it's no wonder that somebody like Hal Ashby would watch Putney Swope and be kind of blown away by it. In fact, Hal Ashby, when he was making The Landlord, which I've talked about in this series, took his whole cast and crew to watch Putney Swope while they were in preparation for The Landlord. And Ashby and Downey remained friends throughout Ashby's life. So you watch the film and you see its influence, especially if you can watch it within the context of 1969, and you understand why so many other filmmakers were turned on by the possibilities of what Downey was doing. So it's definitely a film. It's definitely a great film. It's definitely a film worth looking for. But just know going in that depending on your levels of sensitivity, some parts of it are going to seem a little bit dated and probably more than that, and a little bit off-putting and problematic. But if that's something that you can sort of sit with as a film from the context of its time, you're going to be rewarded by a politically astute, acerbic, absurdist, wonderful mini masterpiece. That's all for now, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. If you've tuned into here, that means you must be getting something out of this video, so I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe. I'd love it if you'd leave a comment and let me know what you think about Putney Swope, what you think about Robert Downey Sr., what you think about what makes this film great. Is there something you'd like to see me talk about in this series? I haven't taken any requests yet, but I'm open to the possibility. In the meantime, my name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.